Thank you very much. I'm hoping just to talk a little bit about long-form journalism and how it relates to the kind of work you're doing and the kind of work being done in the social sciences. And then I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone wants after that. I rather foolishly accepted this invitation to speak. It's something rather pretentiously called a keynote address. Because it's an area in which it talks to an area in which I work, that area between the academy and journalism. And I find myself moving between the two and often grappling with the overlaps, the similarities, the differences, what I bring from the academy when I practice this act called journalism, and what I may bring to the academy when I come from journalism and find myself writing more academic papers and doing a different kind of writing. And it's an interesting area, well worth thinking about and trying to understand the overlaps and the differences and what we can gain and learn from each other. I think it's because I'm in that space between the two areas that the heir to the Star wrote a column about 10 days ago calling me a quasi-scholar. I viewed it as a compliment because I only describe myself as a journalist, so to be a bit of a scholar at the same time is okay with me. I'm not sure he meant it as a compliment. In fact, I'm damn sure he didn't. I would have been upset if he called me a quasi-journalist. Now that would have been hurtful. But let me talk a little first about long-form journalism. What's interesting at the moment is that we're seeing a resurgence of longer, more in-depth kind of writing that falls under this rubric of long-form journalism. And when seeing it in the growth of sites like byliner.com, if you don't know it, you should. Doing quite a lot of interesting stuff in the US with a mostly American material. We're seeing increasingly curated sites that draw together, places like thebrowser.com. We're seeing Kindle shorts, or Kindle singles they're called, and various equivalents of that emerge. And I think it's for a couple of reasons, and it's worth thinking about why. You know, it's on my mind because I myself am involved in a venture called Mampoer Shorts, which is a local e-publishing operation that specializes in what we call long-form journalism. But we try not to call it that because people look quizzical when we say that. We say shorts, but we mean long, but we call them shorts. We mean they're shorter than a book, but longer than what you normally mean by journalism. And it's particularly apt in this country because this country has had very few outlets for long-form journalism that have survived more than a few months because of the finances of producing what previously had been printed magazines in that area. But e-publishing has opened it up, and it's opened up around the world. So the rise of reading devices like the iPad and the Kindle and so on has reopened that area. Outside of the magazines, particularly in America and some in Europe, which tended to carry that sort of material. One thinks of the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and magazines like that, which allow for longer kinds of pieces, which have been a real luxury in journalism, but I think are becoming more commonplace. But I also think it has to do with the fact that in journalism, more and more of the kind of news chasing, the story breaking, the chasing the story that's happening now, is falling to crowdsourcing and citizen journalism, and there's less and less call for journalists just to chase the immediate story because because those kinds of stories are fresh now only for a few minutes before they spread. You know, knowing first that Oscar Pistorius shot his girlfriend was of value to the Bild reporter who had it for about 30 seconds, because they made the decision that it would get out anyway, so they might as well tweet it, and then that reporter lost the story. So less and less of journalism is about chasing the story in that way, chasing the immediate breaking hard news story, because it breaks and it's gone anyway. And I think there's a greater and greater need within this environment, and a greater demand over time, for stuff that brings analysis and thought and context and explanation and ideas that help one get through the mass of instant information being thrown at one. So it's certainly my belief that there's going to be increasing demand for journalism that fills that role, that doesn't try, that still has to be quite quick, but isn't instant in the way it was expected of in the past, because that function is of less importance to journalists, and you can't survive that way anymore. But also I think reading is such that you know, how often do you read a non-fiction book in this country? And I would say very often, when you think that was pretty interesting, but it could have been a third the length. And one knows exactly why this has happened in the past. It's because either you write 2,000 words and the Mail and Guardian cuts it to 1,500, or the Sunday Independent, one or two outlets that will do it. We all know that, don't we? We've all had a fight over those last 50 words. Or you have to write a book. There's been almost nothing in between. And a book, you can't do it 10 or 15 or 20,000 words, so you pad it to 80 or 100 or 120,000, and you can get that published. But I think the reality is that there's huge scope and growing demand for, you know, at Mampoer Shorts we call it the one sitting read. I like to call it the one whiskey read, but my colleagues tell me not to call it that. You know, sit down for an hour or two and really get your teeth into something substantial. And I believe that all the signs are that's a size and a format of the future. Lauren touched on some of the overlaps and the differences between researching and writing academic stuff. Let me take issue with him about something. He said, I'm not a writer. Well, of course he's a writer. He writes. And I think it's increasingly important in this debate and this dialogue that academics see themselves not just as researchers, but as writers, as people who are using that form to communicate to as wide an audience as possible and make it interesting and accessible. Now, clearly one writes in a different way for an academic article than one does when one's writing for a wider journalistic audience. But one of the critical differences is timing. So if you're doing an academic paper looking at some aspect of migrancy in this country, you're quite happy to take a long period of time and for it to come out, if you're lucky, 18 months or 2 years ahead of when you start your process of research. Then you think you've done reasonably well, and often it's 3 or 4 years as it goes through various iterations. Journalists look at this with bewilderment and wonder. We say we can produce newspapers in 12 hours, process millions of words and churn it out. What on earth can take that long? But of course we know that you people probably look at newspapers and say, of course it's produced quickly, and can't you see it's produced quickly? Half of it is wrong, unproven. But in long-form journalism, one's looking, I think, very fruitfully at something in between that. I'm certainly finding myself absolutely enjoying pieces that take me 2 or 3 months, rather than a couple of years to do a book, or an academic article, or the quick news story that one does in a few hours. And finding the richness and the challenge and a whole set of different challenges that come around that sort of length is very exciting and very interesting. And one hopes it also has a longer life, a longer shelf life than the news one churns through quite often as a journalist. I've often thought about whether the differences in the gathering of evidence on the burden of proof, let me put it that way. And I recently had an argument with an academic taking issue with something that appeared in a newspaper, who said, but it was unproven. And I said to her, yes, if you're writing an academic paper, you would say there is insufficient gathering of sufficient information and supportive information, and it was based on one or two interviews, not on a kind of sampling. But the burden of evidence in journalism is different. I'm hesitant to say less, because often it's meant, it's taken to mean the burden is light. But I would emphasize that I think it's different, and this conversation made me think about it. It's a conversation we often have with lawyers, because of course the burden of proof to publish is much less than the burden of proof lawyers need in court, and that frustrates them about journalists often, that we consider having sufficient evidence to say something different to what lawyers do, and different from what academics do. But a lot of the process and the gathering of that information is similar. Of course, I mean, journalists do sample, but they do it in a much more casual, haphazard way. But that basic process of observing, listening, recording, questioning, and processing that information is not dissimilar. And certainly I find that the journalism students we have, in doing a research project, an academic research project, learn an enormous amount that they can take to journalism about understanding the nature of information and evidence, and how to test it and how to verify it. That doesn't mean we can bring the rules of verification, academic rules of verification, into journalism, because time just doesn't allow it. It means, I think, we have to understand the differences and what separates out these things. But the critical difference really is when we're writing long-form journalism, we look for character, we look for scene, we look for story, we look for description. All of those things that you take out of academic papers. Many of those things that you take out of academic papers. And when we want to capture something, we look for something that captures it. We don't attempt to say, a sample of 20 people showed the following when asked questions in a certain way at a certain time. We look for one sentence said, or one thing that happened, or one symbol to capture the same thing. And it's a different challenge, and it's a different way of approaching it. But that is what we look to do. I think that academics are always very concerned about their qualifications. You can't take this and extend it to the whole universe. You have to have ifs and buts in reaching your conclusion, because you can never stretch it too far. The worst thing you can do is take your interviews with 20 people and stretch your conclusions beyond the firm aspects of what they're telling you. Whereas I'm afraid in journalism, that's what we always do. We take one little bit of information, we make a huge amount out of it. And obviously if one does that carelessly, or one overdoes it, then its credibility falls apart and it falls flat. But where one does it skillfully, it's obviously a very interesting and useful thing to do. I spent this last weekend locked in a hotel in London judging the CNN Africa Journalism Awards, which is a fascinating thing to do, because you see interesting journalism from all over the continent in a way one doesn't actually see it in any other forum, I don't think. And most one looks at is in fact the longer pieces, because it's not the quick news pieces that tend to get entered for those kinds of competitions. It is the piece where journalists have taken more time and been given a bit more space to write longer pieces. And what illustrates my point is a piece we discussed at some length. It in fact, an old entry, but it was a point of discussion in a lot of the judging this weekend. And it was a piece about the meaning of soup in Ghana. Soup, like like the first course of the meal, that kind of soup. Not intellectual soup. Soup. And it was a light piece, and it was a very clever piece, and it was very funny. But it told you what was interesting about it was in talking about thin soup and thick soup, and whether you drink it with a spoon or from a cup, or slurp it, or even use your hands, whether you eat it in your family or your group and social, and how in Ghana you can't come to somebody's house without them offering soup, and how different soups mean different things. And what made it a great piece was it told us so much about Ghanaian society. It was an extraordinary piece, and that's journalism, you see. They didn't have to go introduce, analyze the soup, they get its components, interview 20 people on the impact the soup had, or how they eat their soup. The guy just took his knowledge and his observations about soup and used it to make all sorts of comments and remarks, because it was quite an acerbic piece as well, about Ghana and Ghanaian society and traditions through soup. And that's a lot of what we do. We take one little thing and we try and make it speak to a whole lot. I think academics do the opposite. They take a whole lot of information to try and make a little point. Right? We take a little bit of information, we try and make a big point. And one's happiest when one finds something in between, I think. But you see, the point is, it worked because in fact there was a huge amount of information and research and thinking that went, and observation that went behind it. If you just sat down to write a light piece about soup, it would have been like any other light piece about soup. The point about was it clearly for years thought about it, gathered information, talked to people about it, looked at it, observed, and then pulled it together into a very insightful piece. So I know when I go out,
you will.
I can't really. No, in fact, it wasn't a piece from this year. It was a previous year, but it's cited as just a great piece of a certain kind. And because in fact we were debating whether a piece about something like soup could win African Journalist of the Year. Right, because wouldn't people say, soup? But in fact it was a brilliant piece. So I think about my writing experience. I wrote a book about deep fluid, you may know, 2 or 3 years ago. Gosh, I think it's 3 or 4 years ago now. So I started very much in the way any academic would start, and that is reading everything I could find on it and related subjects. And that was enormous, and I probably did more of it because I'm now in the academy and in the academic world than most journalists would do. But I saw the enormous value of seeing the ideas and the thinking around the issues I was looking at before going there. But when I go there, I look for the equivalent of the soup in Ghana. I look for those little things that for me tell a big story. Okay? Because when we're writing as journalists, we look to set a scene. We look to find a character. We look to find the dialogue that brings that to life. And obviously, if you're doing it as academic research, you're looking for different things and different ways to tell that story. But when you're a journalist, when there can be a remark or a look on someone's face, and a huge amount of the writing in journalism is sorting out what detail matters. A huge amount is, you see a whole lot of things, but it's finding the, and people say a whole lot of things, but it's finding the one thing they say, or the raised eyebrow, or the one thing you see in a scene that tells you something about it, and that brings it to life, that tells you so much more, and that captures and engages you. I think it's very interesting. We talk about the kind of blurring of the area between the academy and long-form non-fiction writing. An interesting thing that's happening is the blurring of that space between non-fiction and fiction writing. And that's a different area, and that's a complicated area that journalists grapple with, but is worth thinking about. Increasingly, journalists writing long-form pieces are using the methods and the tools of fiction in telling the story. But it can be quite a hard decision to decide when that crosses a line from non-fiction into fiction, because that line is not an obvious, simple one on deciding what is a fact and what isn't a fact. It's often built around the way one tells the story. And my best example of this, and certainly one of the most interesting examples I've read in recent years, and if you don't know it and haven't read it, you absolutely must. It's a book called Beyond the Beautiful Forevers. Catherine Booth. Do other people know it? Well, get it. Catherine Booth is a New Yorker writer of many years. B-O-O. Just because you'll inevitably ask me, it's such an odd name. Who interestingly suffers from quite a severe illness. I think it's MST, but I'm not sure. Is it rheumatoid arthritis? There we are. So has a great deal of difficulty with her mobility and all sorts of things. Do you know the book? Yeah. You do. So she spent a long period of time in an informal settlement in Mumbai, next to the airport there. And what she did, what she really told the story of one family, one kid really, and built it around the kid and his family and a particular conflict that they got involved in a way that told you so much, so rich. It's clear when you read a piece like that she spent many years observing a whole wide range of things which she's encapsulated into the story of one family in a way that can only be done if you have all that information, all that background. But what's interesting in this context is that when you read it, you have to remind yourself that it's non-fiction, because it reads like fiction. And in fact, there's some who think she does cross a line, because quite often she has dialogue in conversations where she wasn't present. Not quite often, occasionally. So she's in a sense recreated that dialogue. And quite often she tells you what people are thinking. Not quite often again, occasionally. Quite often. She tells you what someone is thinking. And you say, and you remind yourself that it's non-fiction, and you say, well, is she guessing this? Did he tell her that's what he was thinking? Did she piece it together from bits and pieces? And I don't know the answer. It's a book of remarkable authenticity, but uses these techniques that certainly as a journalist we're told to be careful of, and which certainly makes me a little bit queasy, And I say that thinking it's completely one of the most brilliant books I've read in recent years. And she's just remarkable, and I keep saying to myself, despite myself, that it doesn't really matter. The point is she's captured something extraordinary about the place and the people, and has an extraordinary understanding. And how exactly she came to that is, I'm scared of saying it's a nicety, because it isn't. It's obviously important and needs to be thought about and discussed. But I don't want to suggest it devalues her work, but it does raise important questions that we have to ask and think about when we're doing this kind of writing. I think I want to end on that thought, or end with one more thought. I mean, the real lesson of Catherine Boo for me was the time she took, and that became apparent in every word she wrote. And that's something we don't normally do as journalists. It's something that often isn't possible as journalists. It's something academics do to excess, take time, and I say that jokingly. But it's reflected in the richness of the piece. So what makes it a brilliant piece is, having spent the time to do extraordinarily extended research in various ways, she then encapsulated it with a storytelling technique that I found absolutely riveting. And that's why I think it's such an interesting example.